Hi. Here we are. There's kind of like always a sinking sensation when I first show up, where I'm like, did the bot remember? And the bot came through. The bot managed to mention on our Discord that we're live 8 minutes after we started and 2 minutes before we actually, tuned into the thing. So a little bit of like, oh no, and then it worked out. So at least we have that going for us. How is everybody? Hopefully the people are doing all right, feeling okay. Let me just make sure that I've got chat open so that I can see all y'all lovely faces here. Today, just got back from your L5R. How was Legend of the Five Rings for you, Kung Fu Fenris? Was it as good as I could hope? L5R, the game that I most wish I could play but can't on stream, I think is where I'm at right now, at least when it comes to that. So today we're going to be talking about, let me just pull it up here so that I can give you the link. There is a video that was provided by Bob Worldbuilder called The Ultimate D&D Session 0 Checklist, and it came with the checklist itself, and I will slap that in there. Oh, it's through Discord, because it got uploaded. Requiem uploaded it directly to Discord, so that link may or may not work for people if you are not actually joined to our Discord. But you could do that too. I suppose I should also turn that bot on. So give me 2 seconds. I'll take care of that. I can keep talking while I'm turning this computer on. You'd think that I'd remember by now that I actually have to, do it from this computer, another computer, an entirely different one than the one that I streamed from for clinic hours. But I have an embarrassment of computers, I think is the way you're going to describe it. But the bot should be active at this point, and I can slip back in here. Well, no, of course you're not going to hear me terribly well because I'm not actually at the computer, but I think the bot should be working now at this point. What was all of that? I was turning on the bot. I have an embarrassment of computers in this place. In this office alone, there are 3 computers, and then I'm not including things like phones or game consoles or whatever. I have a desktop computer and 2 laptops in here. Now, admittedly, part of that is for work, but we actually stream from, when we stream on Sundays, we stream from a laptop. The reason being that it is a mobile computer that we can move around. We have to reconfigure the space in order to make sure that we can get everybody seated where they need to be seated and all that. So that's kind of what we have to look forward to. At any rate, Requiem, in Requiem's Infinite Wisdom, passed along this Ultimate Session 0 checklist. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at it, at least to start off here, and we're going to go through it, see what we think, see what we agree with, see what we might change ourselves. The idea of a Session 0 checklist, I think, is a good idea for people who are relatively new to Session Zeros, or people who are new to the hobby of role-playing in general. It's kind of like an important thing to do to move through these. I personally don't use checklists for my Session Zeros because I kind of know exactly what I want to discuss, but I think that it's great for people who don't necessarily have experience with it. It kind of gives them a framework that they can lock it down. Oh, of course, I talk about you all the time, Requiem, because you come up with such great questions and great topics. The other topic that was potentially going to happen today was an RPGClinic After Dark, but this won the poll, so I guess y'all are looking forward to more Session 0 than you are looking forward to discussing relationships and sex and role-playing. which is kind of like a yearly topic around here. But who knows? If we get through this really fast, we may just swap over because, useful. Still useful to talk about. And we've got a backup, and backups are fun too. So why don't we have a look at this? Let's have a look at the checklist. I'd love to hear your impressions of the checklist as we kind of go through it. Anything that you want to comment on, just throw it right on in there. We'll pop you out on the screen and we'll go for a good old-fashioned clinic hours time together. So let's have a look. So the first thing that we're going to do when we start out is we're going to say that we're going to have the introduction here. A session 0 is a meeting before you officially begin your campaign where you discuss everyone's expectations for the game. It is how you learn what your players want so you can tailor the experience to them and keep them invested over time. This checklist is a framework for the framework you will build during your session 0. You should check out this video walkthrough and review the list beforehand, then discuss each section with your group and revisit this checklist to make adjustments as your campaign evolves. I haven't seen the video walkthrough. I admit that I did not look at that, and I won't rebroadcast it on Twitch. Obviously, I don't have permission to do that. But I'll say first off, session 0 should be capitalized. It's a big deal, right? You have it up here, session 0. Let's capitalize this stuff right here. So this is correct. This is a session 0. This is a pretty good description of what a session 0 is supposed to do. It's discussing everyone's expectations for the game and tailoring the experience to them. So that's kind of happy. Steam was updating a game. Yeah, it happens to me all the time. Requiem. We have to be careful. I've set limits to my Steam because I don't want it to go on when somebody's streaming, either me or somebody else in this place. So I have to be careful about that. So let's have a look. Let's go through and see what it looks like. Team building. Starting with yourself or a volunteer, go around the group and have everyone answer the following questions. Use the space below to record everyone's names and make notes about their responses. Trust me, this will be fun to read in the future. So, what's one thing you love about RPGs? This could be a favorite moment from a previous campaign, why they're excited to play, like strategy, story, or social interaction, or anything else. Are you most excited by combat, exploration, puzzles, or roleplay? And finally, as a player, what's one strength you bring to the group? If someone can't think of their own strengths, let others share a strength they see in that player. This is a pretty good start. I love the idea of what's one thing you love about RPGs, because it kind of immediately puts what we're looking at into sharp focus, right? Session 0 is not mentioned in 5th edition, that's why I wanted to make this. They do mention it now, I believe. I think they mention it in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, if I don't miss my guess. But it is true. The 5th edition doesn't mention it. They almost certainly will when 6th edition rolls around. This is a good question to ask just because it's a great idea of, hey, so what do you want out of a game? It's coming a little late. If you're at a session 0, I think the expectation is you're going to be playing in this game. And I do think that it's worth your while to find out what people are interested in when it comes to a game before you actually invite them into the group, in order to make sure that they're going to be compatible with the kind of game you want to run. If you are the kind of person who really likes in-depth character work, the idea of social interaction, as mentioned here on the list, and that's what you really come for, but the rest of the people at their table expect that the entire game is going to be strategy and dice rolling, and very little in terms of roleplay, then this person's caught. They've shown up to a session 0 only to find out that they have to turn around and leave, or at least be bitterly disappointed that they're not getting the game they want. But I can't really fault them for that. A lot of people kind of join a game and that's the game they're going to play. That's the game that's available to them. They want to play with their friends, or this is the group that they had available to them, so this is what they're going to do. So in a way, I don't really mind that this isn't here. Hey, thanks, Ellie. Hey, where's my alert? Are the alerts broken? I'm actually kind of worried that the alerts may be busted. because I haven't seen them pop up recently. And I wonder whether that's just because Streamlabs is messing up a bit. I'm going to try logging in just to see. Because I'm on my alerts. There's the alert box. Let's just make sure that the widget URL is what it's supposed to be. And then let's try, we'll go back to a recent event. Okay, well, kind of works. But that's the other alert box. It's not the original one. You'll give me the proper link. Thank you, Kate. Kate's on the ball. So, at any rate, this is here. I'd still recommend that you try to answer these questions before session 0, but it doesn't hurt to answer them during session 0 because it helps to have everyone at the group know all at once what they're kind of going for, what's sort of gathering everybody together. Are you most excited by combat, exploration, puzzles, or roleplay? It's kind of like the same question as above, but it helps to ask a question more than once. Sometimes you're going to get different answers from people as they kind of clue into, oh, this is what I'm actually supposed to be answering right now. And I look a fright. I should have shaved before I went out here. Oh, whatever. It happens. And as a player, what's one strength you bring to the group? If someone can't think of their own strengths, let others share a strength they see in that player. I don't like this question. I don't like this question because I don't like putting people on the spot and saying, what are you good at? Because what are you good at can be a difficult question to answer for like the best of people. It also kind of appeals to a certain type of player, the kind of person who has no trouble sort of bringing forward their personal beliefs and their personal strengths. All right, let's see if that worked. Let's go back to our recent events. There we go. Look at that. Kate saves the day once again. Now, because I know that I would have difficulty answering this question, not because I can't think of a strength that I have. I know the strengths that I have, but because I hate bragging. 1 subscription, 3 alerts. Ellie, you're just that cool. What can I say? I don't like bragging about myself. I especially don't like bragging about myself when you're getting involved in a game that might have some amount of emotional vulnerability out there. You don't want to be sitting there being like, well, I'm brand new to role-playing, and have somebody else come in and say, oh, my strength? Yeah, I've been playing since I was 12 years old. I know everything about role-playing. I've killed the Tarrasque, I've become a Justicar, and I don't know, got a royal flush in Deadlands. Fine. And that might be really intimidating to somebody who's sitting there being like, well, what's my strength to the group? I guess my strength is that I suck, and and then they leave. So I don't actually like that question. I would prefer that if you're going to keep this question in the checklist, it would be share a strength you see in somebody else at the table. Old-timey reference? Look, I'm here for you, Kung Fu Fenris. I am here for you. Because it's nice. This is part of the reason why in our kind of cooldowns after game, in our after game kind of check-ins, I have players talk about each other's accomplishments, not their own. It would be, I ask, what did you learn? Then I ask, what is a game highlight that you want to bring that somebody else at the table? And the reason why is I don't want to be like, what do you think you did that was cool today? Because, I genuinely think that this is a question that can make people feel uncomfortable. And it is not It is not the moment that I want to introduce stress. So, not my favorite question here, but, not something that I'm absolutely against. Scheduling comes next. Discuss how long the group can reasonably commit to playing, such as blank weeks, months, or years. So every week, every month, every year, depending on where you are in the stage of your life, this might be days. Hell, this could be hours for some people. There have definitely been times where I've been like, yeah, we can play every week. Except, hey, are you busy now? Okay, well, let's just, knock out a session in the next 3 hours. So that's fine, though. How long the group can reasonably commit to playing. That's the next is the frequency. This is how long they want to keep playing for. I think that's a reasonable question to ask. Some people might be like, yeah, I'm down to do this for a few weeks and that's it. And some people might be like, no, I'm ready for the long haul. I don't think I'd want to hold people to this answer, though. I think it's a better idea of getting to know where everybody stands right now and what people's expectations are. I am ready to play this game for the next 2 months and then we'll see is a way better answer than I guess we can just play for however long. Hey, Kaiser Omnic. I'm good for a decade. I mean, it's been done. Ellie actually has a great question, which I'm going to throw up here because I think that's, and by question I mean suggestion. I think I'd prefer something like name a thing about RPGs that you're curious to try instead. That's a great question. Hey, what do you want to give a shot? And not necessarily what do you want to give a shot about in this campaign, but name a thing about RPGs that you're curious to try means that it kind of opens you up to a bit more. I'm interested in trying out a character who's a healer. I've never played a healer before. I'm interested in doing some political maneuvering. I think that would be cool in this game. I'm interested in trying to play a character without needing to look at the book every 5 minutes. These are all questions that can give you an insight into what the player's looking for, and what your fellow players are looking for. It's really important to note, answering these questions isn't just for the storyteller, it's for everybody to know, and I think that that's still useful information for everyone to have. Such as, I want to try playing a character on my own without relying on too much help, is a great indicator that this person might not want you to backseat play them. Decide how often the group wants to play. Decide how long a typical session should last. These can be variable. There's no reason why you couldn't say, hey, so today, do you want to try playing for 5 hours instead of 3 hours? And if everyone's okay with it, great. But it is important to set this up. I, for instance, don't like playing, when I'm playing a tabletop role-playing game, I don't like playing longer than 3 hours normally. Occasional times where we're playing longer, it's fine. It's great. But because the way that I play is heavily improvisational, I'm thinking real hard for a long period of time. And oftentimes I can't kind of lean on combat to suck time up. You'll notice in a lot of games that if combat starts, that's an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours that just fly by because you are negotiating combat. Now, it doesn't necessarily fly by in the moment for you, but in terms of the overall content of the session, combat can take up a lot. But if there's no combat in a session, then you're just going straight through. It's straight talking, straight politicking. 3 hours is kind of where I'm good after 3 hours most of the time, because I'm doing that much improvisational work. I just don't want to get mentally fatigued. Occasionally, I like to go a little later. If things are going well, why not? But I also have limits because I stream my games, and generally I don't like to stream longer than expected. People sort of set their schedules sometimes when it comes to streams, and it shows that you're not really respecting their schedule, especially because we have a lot of viewers who are from time zones that come way before ours, in which case you're saying, okay, yeah, I know that it's late for you, but you got to stay up even later. Get wrecked. So there is that. Deciding where to play or a backup location. Another thing that should be discussed in the session 0. Even if you know that this will change, establishing this sort of thing early on is kind of like what I keep harping on about. The older you get, the more you're going to want to make sure you've got a schedule, and part of a schedule is location. The logistics of your game will become the hardest part. And if you get that sorted out beforehand, if you get it sorted out early, you're doing yourself a huge favor. If you do not set these things out early on, you're going to find that a lot of your time and stress when it comes to this game is just getting everybody in the same place. Eliminate that as best you can. You might as well get this discussed here in a session 0. Decide what day and time to play. Sure, I really do recommend, if you can, to get a regular time going. It makes scheduling easier. Saying when we're available doesn't work in a lot of ways because people do not prioritize or slot at that time. I know Sunday evenings, that's my time to game. That's when it's going to happen. I don't schedule things at that time because I just know I'm busy. In much the same way that you don't schedule times during when you have a regular workout or when you have to go to work, or if you know that on Friday evenings you visit your parents. Great, then you know what's going on. And if you do that for your games, you're going to be much happier. And decide how long to wait if somebody is late X minutes. I think this is an interesting question to put on here. It's not one I would have thought of. I actually don't have that much of a problem with it. As Kaiser Obnik is saying, how long to wait if someone is late makes me think that it can be a good idea to set a start of session socializing time beforehand. This is actually the question that I would want to put on here if I was doing a checklist. I think socializing before a game is important. I do think that you want to get people, you want them to shake off the dust of the day that they've picked up. Maybe they're friends who haven't seen each other in a while and they're going to want to catch up. You do not want to let this bleed over into your time where you're playing. If you follow the way that I try to do it, where you hit and establish that magic circle and then move on, you want this to happen outside the magic circle. You want them to do that before they enter your world. So I think that it's really important that you establish that time. Similarly, if there are things like, yeah, we want to eat, but we want to eat before game while we're socializing, I think that's also a really good idea. I tend to say that snacks during game, great. Eating dinner during game, it can be tough. Or lunch or whatever, it can be tough unless you're just all ordering pizza and eating it that way. So these are questions that I think are important to throw down on. And as Kaiser Omnic says, my games usually start 50 to 20 minutes after the planned start time. Our streams start at 6. We actually don't get together at 6. We get together earlier than that. Part of it is because it's our time to socialize amongst ourselves, but also because that's when we eat. We eat before game. And when we sit down and the stream starts, we have our pre-game timer where people are tuning in and showing up, giving people a chance to sort of get settled, giving us a chance to go over any last minute stuff that we have to do. But when the actual stream starts, we don't start until 15 minutes in either. Part of that is because we greet our guests, we do our safety demonstration, we go over what experience we have to spend, but some of it is just like us, talking at the beginning of the game. It's to settle us in, to get us ready for the ride. And I think that that's an important thing that people should be taking into account right at the start. Requiem says, possibly the wisest thing that's ever been said on this channel ever. When we're available is a quick way to have a game end after the first session. I'm stealing that, Requiem. I am going to use that from now on because it gets everybody excited for one session, and the second session is very hard to make happen at that point. So I definitely agree. Hey, NFL! Been catching up on Academy? I can't blame you for that. So, Requiem, 10 points to you on that one. That's an excellent thing to say. Discuss. A session will be canceled or rescheduled if the DM is absent. So, this is our first indicator that this is a session 0 template for D&D specifically, as it is D&D that refers to the storyteller as a DM or dungeon master. When we get through the rest of them, we're going to actually have a look to see what else they sort of say and suggest in there. So we're going to have to base a little bit of our analysis and critique of this on the fact that it is designed for one specific game. So that might become more important later on. we'll see. But I'm going to continue to use the term storyteller throughout. As we've discussed earlier, even though you will sometimes hear me use terms like GM or DM, I prefer storyteller at this point, even though I know that it's kind of specific to White Wolf, World of Darkness, Onyx Path games. I prefer storyteller because I also, I'm not super comfortable with the concept of the storyteller referring to themselves as the game master. It has some loaded language, which isn't as much of an issue for me. The language that I actually don't like is the idea that they are the ones in control, that they are the ones who manipulate the whole thing. No matter how true or false that is, I don't like putting that much pressure and that much responsibility and that much onus on the storyteller, and I also don't like the players feeling like they are somehow lesser than. Players are actually the ones who should be driving the story. They're the protagonists, not you. But this question here, so a session will be canceled or rescheduled if the DM is absent or if blank players are absent. This is actually a really good thing to work out. For instance, for our streams, we don't necessarily cancel the stream if one player can't make it. We try to come up with ways that we can write that character out for a session. Our games are heavily social, so in a way it can be a little harder to sort of say like, well, you know, we were coming up with some really interesting plans, but all of a sudden this person is just not available. But we have found ways to split the party before. We'll absolutely find ways to split the party again. So we do have this ability, and we have also experimented with some things. People can remember that while we were running Changing the Streaming, we had a series of 3 weeks where only one player was available. They were one-on-one sessions. And those one-on-one sessions, I adored. I would do that again. Absolutely. It was a ton of fun. But part of the reason we did those one-on-one sessions is because we found that there were a couple of weeks in a row where people weren't just going to be able to make it. So we made that work. But another big question here is, what do you do when your storyteller is absent? So Requiem, I don't know if it's strictly relevant to D&D. We'll see what happens when it keeps going. But the fact that it mentions DM means that this was designed around the idea of D&D, which, you know, some gamers are going to complain about no matter what, because they don't like the idea that D&D is the default de facto role-playing game, but whatever. Yeah, if your storyteller is absent, can you actually run a game? And the answer is yes, depending on the kind of games that you run. You might just have a time where all the players just sit down and just interact in character and there isn't a storyteller. And that could be a lot of fun for them, but not all groups are going to react well to this. I'd actually wager to say most groups probably won't. And I'm getting some messages here, which I'm going to just minimize that window because it is not the time for messages. Goodbye. I would also point out that you may just want to gather anyway, whether your storyteller can make it or not, whether you can play the game or not. It might still be worth it to say, no, but I'm going to socialize with people, and that's going to be fun too. Iron Sword. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely, Kaiser, Omnic. That's a definitely, there are games where you don't need a storyteller at all. And it might still be worth it for everybody to get together, but that's a thing that your group can decide and figure out on their own. I think that also a session 0 checklist is not a session 0 contract. Contracts are not what we're looking at here. I think that all of this stuff can be negotiable later on or after the fact. The fact that you can walk in and say, hey, so we agreed that we would all get together if the storyteller wasn't available. You don't have to like hold people to it like that. I spent 3 hours spending XP. For some games, for some groups, that's what it'll take. So discuss. If a player is absent, then their character will be played by the storyteller, will be played by another player, is with the party but inactive, or is not with the party. A great question to throw out there. My group typically, this is me and my personal beliefs. I refuse to play a PC. I will not. I don't think it's fair. I believe that in the kinds of games that I run, there's so much agency that comes with these things, that players' actions matter so much, that it would feel very strange to allow somebody else to cover a PC, to run them, as it were. And we've extended that. I mean, even in something like Disconcordia, the mass changeling game that we're running over on a separate Discord server, which has been going super well so far. We've been very pleased with it. We don't even, like, I wouldn't even play another player's NPC. There's only one that we allow right now, and that's the parrots. And the parrots are sort of a special thing, and I don't think that matters that much if other people play it. But we don't play each other's NPCs. It just doesn't feel to me like the same kind of game at that point. So I would definitely say that for me, if you asked me this question, I'd instantly say the character's not with the party, or they're inactive and do not participate. I would prefer not with the party completely. And if there isn't a way to remove that character from the party tidily, then it doesn't continue, because the idea that somebody should be with the party and therefore should be participating in this, it's hard to get past. So that's my particular answer on this, but other groups may feel differently. And so this is something that should be discussed beforehand. You especially do not want to find out that you don't discuss this, you miss a session, and somebody else has played your character. You might feel awful, and I've seen this happen. So it's best to get this discussion out of the way. A plea from Kaiser Obnick: please, storytellers, don't kill PCs when their player isn't there. Good advice. Table expectations. Let's go. Decide if food is acceptable during gameplay, yes or no. We used to eat during... we used to eat sometimes during streams. We don't anymore, unless it's a special occasion. And even then, we're much more aware of the fact that it gets picked up on mics. At first, we just kind of didn't care. Now, I think we care a bit more. But yeah, food acceptable during gameplay, definitely a thing to ask. Some players will not like it, some players will, and sometimes it actually depends on where you play and when. Decide if alcohol is acceptable during gameplay, yes or no. I'd expand that. I would make that more than just alcohol. I think that these days, the idea that marijuana is consumed more and more often as a recreational drug, I think is just as valid as alcohol. Alcohol is also a drug. So the idea of just being like, hey, so is this okay or not? I think it's a good question to ask, even if you think you know the answer, because it also kind of inevitably, when somebody asks this, the answer ends up being like, yeah, as long as everybody can handle themselves, as long as nobody's drunk or way too high. And sometimes that's kind of something you just need people to be aware of. Alcohol is definitely focused during gameplay. I don't know what you mean by it being a America focused. Where can one find this checklist? You're a bit tardy to the party. You can find it on our Discord. It is uploaded there in the Clinic Hours channel. Requiem Lost was actually the one who found this, and it's attached, I believe, to a YouTube video, which is put out by Bob World Builder. Decide if... Yeah, I'm not sure why this is America focused. I'm just curious about that. I don't necessarily disagree with you. Just curious. Decide if smartphones are acceptable during gameplay, yes or no. Alcohol addressed and not other sorts of substances. Yeah, depending on where you live, that could absolutely make a big difference. Smartphones are a great tool for looking things up. Are they acceptable during gameplay, yes or no? Definitely a great question. I know that for me, when this comes up, smartphones are available for two reasons. If you need to, and if you are using it as a tool for the game. But I generally, I don't like seeing cell phones at a table. If somebody's using a smartphone, it generally means they're no longer paying attention to what's happening. Even if they're looking stuff up. If they're looking something up for the game, then that means that their attention is focused somewhere and not on what's happening in game. Sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes you absolutely have to do that because you're like, I don't know what to do next round of combat. It's way better for you to look it up now than it is for you to look it up when it's your turn and making everybody wait for you. But smartphones as a question here, absolutely a good one. I'd keep it. No problem. Groups who use Roll20 even in person on tablets or phones. I actually, when I was playing D&D at work, back when we were all together at work, we actually used Roll20. The stuff was programmed into Roll20, but we were all sitting around a television with Roll20 up on the screen. And it worked out well for that group. So it's absolutely a thing. Avatar of Cain points something out, which I find kind of interesting and I think is worth looking at. I think that's a fair question, but the document is way too leading with that small note. I am inclined to agree that the way that it's positioned is a little strange. I do think that it is important to remind people that like there may be reasons for using smartphones other than distraction, but I would put it that way. Saying smartphones are a great tool for looking things up basically is saying you should let smartphones at your table. And I don't think that's necessarily a great idea. Otherwise, why bother asking the question? What instead you should be doing is discussing, are you allowed to use your smartphone for other things than looking up game stuff? When I am running a game, I would make this point. If I was playing, I would also request this point. But basically, if I see that you're using a smartphone for something that's other than the game itself, that's to me a sign that you're not engaged, and it means that I'm not doing my job. If it continues to happen, then at that point, I assume that the player doesn't actually want to be there, or I have to figure something out. Now, there are ways and times where this might not necessarily be the case. There are definitely people who may not be neurotypical, who require distraction or who can't help themselves. So there are definitely circumstances under which this might be another question. But I would say that for me, my comfort level is if I see that you've disengaged from the game, that makes my experience less enjoyable. So it helps. Yeah, exactly. Kate makes a very good point. Like, if you're going to say, hey, smartphones are useful, then why aren't you also mentioning hungry players might be hangry players? This is a fucking good point. I have played with groups that are absolutely, they're too tired to play, they're too hungry to play. They're playing on, say, like a Wednesday, knowing that Wednesday's the day that, this is a real story, by the way. There was a group that at one point that I knew of. I was never part of this group, but they were in like my general gaming vicinity. I never played in this game, but they were playing on Wednesdays and then realized they couldn't play on Wednesdays because they all worked in a flower warehouse, and Wednesdays tended to be days where they'd get big shipments. So they'd all be exhausted at the end of the day, and then they tried gaming and it just didn't work out. Once they shifted the game's date to a different day of the week, they found that they had a way better time. So there's other things to take into account. If we're going to include notes, let's include these notes under a lot of other things, because if we're going to start saying there may be reasons why you want to consider doing this or not, let's put them in there. So Elliot says, I need to knit during game or have something, otherwise I start walking around. This is, to me, not the same thing as being disengaged from the game. Fiddling with something with your hands, having something to burn off excess energy, all of that stuff is great. I totally agree with it. Hell, during the course of, I mean, look, if I was doing this as a professional, I wouldn't be doing it. And I have that skill, but I'm not doing this as a professional. I am doing this after a day of work. I've been destroying a plastic knife. I've been snapping it to pieces while talking to you. I tend to like to have my hands occupied with something. The knitting does not fall under that. What falls under that is this. Because if I see that your attention has been drawn specifically to you engaging with something outside where you cannot multitask at all, That's the problem. If you are watching a video or you're reading an article online, you're not paying attention to the game. Knitting, I believe you could be paying attention to this game. And that, micro drop of attention where you have to, say, start a new line or tie something off or whatever is not enough to fully distract you from the game entirely. Whereas an article basically demands your attention. Doodling, absolutely. Doodling is a great example of something that people can do while also paying attention. In one of my previous gaming groups, I had two people who were professional illustrators, and they would be doodling every session of every game. Sometimes they'd be drawing what's happening in the game. Sometimes they'd be drawing something else. Didn't matter. They just had to have pens or pencils or paints in their hands, but they still ended up playing just fine. So I will say fidgeting is not the same as disengagement. Distraction is not what I'm worried about. It's disengagement. But yeah, definitely a good point to bring up because that's important, and I do the same thing. Heck, sometimes, if you get a text message and you're like, oh, I just got to check this, it's fine. I just don't want you texting for the next, 2 hours with somebody. That's not, because that means that you are more engaged in another conversation. But if you're distracted momentarily because somebody's asking you a question, you just want to answer it, not a problem at all. But again, these are things that you can discuss during a session 0 to figure out, where do you stand? Where do you lie? Decide how much time should be allotted to review a ruling. Blank seconds or minutes. I'd prefer this to say, decide what you should do if a ruling is required. Because what I would say is, eventually the storyteller makes a ruling, and then after game, you can challenge it. I don't mind being challenged during game. You'll see it in my streams where I'll get the audience challenging my rulings, and quite often I'll be like, oh yeah, and I'll fix it. Because I, at this point in my life, no longer am interested in sitting down and memorizing a book. I used to be that person where I would have like every rule just baked into my brain. And these days I don't have that kind of time. There are too many games, too many things to worry about, and my mental processes are also now divided between running a game, curating and reacting to an audience, and running a stream. All of that stuff just makes my life harder. So I enjoy it when people bring stuff up, but I also reserve the right to be like, I've made my decision. We can talk about it after game if we want. So that's kind of what I would do instead of saying, hey, how much time should we allot to this? Seconds, minutes, because I also would feel really fucking self-conscious if I was discussing a ruling with a player and then another player just started being like, okay, go. Your 30 seconds are up, right? Like that would just be fucking nightmare for me. So, divorce lawyer Trump's dragon fight. Yeah, I'd say so. It is also, if you know that you're going to be disengaged from the game for a long period of time, it is often better for you to stand up and walk away so that you're not providing a distraction to other players. So I don't think I like the idea of decide how much time. I much prefer the idea of discussing what should be done when a ruling is required. And in general, I know what my answer is, but not every thing will do that. I think it's more for tables where folks will debate rules for half an hour. I do think that it is important to establish that, we're not going to do this for half an hour, but I don't like the idea of kind of putting it up to that amount of time. I think that some groups might react well to it, though. I'm not saying that this is a bad question. I'm saying that I would rephrase the question for me to just say, decide what to do when a ruling is required. But again, this is also something that is designed for newer audiences. This may be a better question to ask a newer audience because it forces them to make a concrete decision. Discuss how much player knowledge overlaps with character knowledge. This is essentially a question that, if we're rephrasing it using advanced terminology, is how much are we allowing metagaming in this? And I think that's a fine question to ask. I think it's a simple question to answer in a lot of ways, but I think it's a fine question to ask. Decide on a preferred depth of roleplay, Stranger Things or Critical Role. I assume that this is covered better in the video that accompanies this. I would say that this is probably Stranger Things is we're adventurers and we roll dice and hit things, and Critical Role is, we're telling a story and we're getting deep into characterization. I just don't like the fact that we're linking it to these two things. The reason why is, first of all, if you haven't watched Stranger Things or Critical Role, you're missing a big part of this question's context. It implies cultural knowledge that I don't think people need to have. And the second thing is that it also it implies that there are two balances. There's either you're going hard on the rules and mechanics, or you're going ham on your role playing. And I think that there's a wider spectrum than that. I also don't like the idea of bringing up Critical Role in a session 0. And the main reason why is because I think that it's all too common for people to try to compare themselves with Critical Role, and this is a bad idea. It's the Matt Mercer effect, and it messes people up. Your game is going to be your game, and to try to put it on the pedestal, the same pedestal as a game that literally has a crew behind it running it, with people who have been doing this for decades, who are professional entertainers, is really difficult to throw out there. So don't do it. So I would definitely reword this question. I would reword this to what is your level of desired roleplay versus mechanical play or strategic play. I also really resist the term role play, ROLL play, as in like, I like rolling dice, because I think that it's diminutive, and it sort of implies that people who like playing the strategic side of the game aren't really role playing. And I hate that. I personally I don't fall on one extreme. I really like role playing, and I don't think anybody who's watched any of the games that I've run would be surprised by my saying that. But I also like engaging in game mechanics and systems. So I don't like the idea that one of them isn't real or not. So, and not all games roll dice. That's definitely true. Depth of roleplay, amount of combat. I think that it's better to, instead of saying, do you prefer this over this? I think it's better to say, how much of this is important to you? How much is this important to you? And do you have a priority? As opposed to, where on this sliding scale do you fall? Because I also think that sliding scales are hard for people to balance. Have you ever done a survey where it asks you things like, on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you like about this? What do you like about that? Do you agree with this statement? And the reality is that people are hesitant to answer the extremes, even if they should. Not all people, but most people who take surveys, if you say, rate this on a scale of 1 to 10, they're very hesitant to say 1s or 10s. One way of describing this is the Kinsey scale of sexuality, which was ranking yourself on a scale of 0 to 6, 0 being completely heterosexual and 6 being completely homosexual. And the issue with a scale like that is that it becomes very difficult for some people to sort of say like, well, I don't feel comfortable being on an extreme, even if that's where they need to be. So it's too tempting to say, well, I guess I'm like a 2, when in reality you're probably a 0. Or I feel like I'm a 5, even though you could never see yourself being with somebody of the opposite sex. So admittedly, I probably pulled the worst possible example of a survey question. But when given a sliding scale, people tend to avoid extremes, which is not useful, but they also are very bad at judging where they should be. If somebody says, well, I like role playing and I like systems play, they tend to put themselves right in the center. And right in the center is also not necessarily useful, because does that mean that you want to spend half your time playing combat and half your time role playing? Does it mean that you don't care? Does it mean that there's so much that's bad about the statistic that it's not worth considering? We move on. Let's see. Speaking of moving on, decide on a general tone, dramatic or comedic. I think that's a good question to ask. I think that tones can change throughout a game, and I think that sometimes you can have very special episodes. I do think, though, that it's an important question to ask because you do not want to find out that everyone expects one and they get the other instead. Somebody who's looking for an edgy, hardcore, dramatic, gritty game is not going to be thrilled when everyone at the other table is looking for bubblegum, sugar, happy, fun pop, because that's a genuine clash of styles. Wouldn't mood change what they would answer on a scale? Absolutely. Completely. And that goes for, critical questions about your personal well-being, right to what kind of role-playing you want to play. We're also really bad at judgments. It's been shown that judges are more likely to be lenient in sentencing if they're not hungry. Right? So if you're going to court, try to get your court case scene right after lunch. Remind your players that all characters get time in the spotlight if they want it. So this is the first time that we, instead of it being like a question or a discussion, this is the checklist directly telling people, hey, this is what you should do in a game. Which I think that that's still a good thing to bring up to a new group, but it's sort of weird that it's here. Because this is a deliberate statement as opposed to a question, and that means that what is the purpose of this document? Is it a checklist of things you need to go over, or is it a checklist of things you need to discuss? So far, it's just really been discussion. Or is it a mixture of both? And this is the first time that we've been given a specific directive. So it's a little out of place here. All characters get time in the spotlight if they want it. I do think that that's a good thing to point out to new players, though. As long as you can stick to it, as long as you make that a possibility. And remember, that's not just the storyteller's responsibility, it's everyone's, to make sure that people get their chance to be in the spotlight. It is very tempting to burst in on a moment that someone is having and ruining their fucking day. So as a thing that I will point out, on Disconcordia, we actually have a lot of players who are like, man, I totally want to get in on this scene, but I don't want to interrupt it. And I think that's a basic form of, I want to give somebody their spotlight. And I think that that's a nice way to do it. I do think that sometimes we're a little too nice. Sometimes you should interrupt because that's the point. And sometimes interruption can make for really interesting situations. But it is that awareness of this might not be the most appropriate moment to ruin somebody's scene is a great thing to point out there. I know that for me, sometimes that comedy of, I really hope that people aren't interrupted because they're just about to fight, and now would be the worst possible time for the kid to show up, and then the kid shows up. Sometimes that's great. But also, if they've been almost fighting for 7 different scenes, and every time somebody shows up and stops it, that can really kind of put somebody in a bad mood. So that's a thing to keep in mind. Discuss how much narrative control the players have. Yep, some of this is set out by the system. Some systems give players narrative control by default. Some of them specifically take it away. It is worth it to discuss. I do think that narrative control is sometimes a misunderstood term, and I think that you need to define it. Because I would say that my players ultimately have, they're the protagonists and they're the drivers of the story, and they have more, like, their overall wishes on how the game goes has more influence on the game than I think that it might appear. But I don't necessarily give them what a lot of games would call narrative control. They don't get to decide what happens as a result of their dice rolls. I do. And I keep that consistent to sort of keep the story going. Some groups work well that way, others don't. But I think that you kind of have to define narrative control a little bit better. Man, people dropping truth all over the stream today. Elliot says, sometimes an interruption is a great way of pushing new energy in a really intense scene that has been going for a while. Yeah. Sometimes you need something. You need a catalyst. D&D has plot points as an optional rule for that. Nobody uses it. Yeah. No, I agree. So yeah, narrative control, define it better. but I do think that's a conversation that you should have. Discuss takebacks or retconning will be permitted when, if the DM misrepresents a scene or a creature, if a player describes your character's actions as an obvious joke, or before the player rolls. Yeah, I don't have a problem with this being on here. I think that in general, just the description of like how beholden are we to the rules and to continuity is a good question to make. I will make mistakes. I have definitely made mistakes. There's a lot for me to keep track of. I will introduce a character and forget something that I introduced about that character. Then the next time the character appears, things look different. And there's only so many times it can be like, aha, well, it's good that you noticed that. I was intending for that to be a mystery for you to solve. There's only so many times you can pull that shit off. So yeah, this is something that I definitely want to discuss. To basically tell players, you know, like, just so that you know if you notice something and it's strange and you bring it up, that I might have to retcon it because I fucked up. But the reality is that if there's a fuck up, you kind of have to do something about it. Retconning setting expectations for that is good, because on the one hand, I would hate to see a player just like get really frustrated at a game because you said, no, you said you do this, and so that's what's going to happen, even if they were joking. Like, that's awful. But I also don't want somebody retconning something that happened 3 sessions ago just because they're like, oh, I didn't realize that would happen and my character would never do that. Well, maybe that's a legitimate excuse sometimes, but other times it's just because you don't want to fail. So dangerous. Dangerous. Hey, Ravana, thank you for 14 months. Very kind. Pukajutsu, we wouldn't have the running gag of Descentra almost seeing something she didn't want to if there weren't interruptions. Fair enough. Fair enough. Requiem points out also, it is good to know that retcons can happen so it does not come out of nowhere. Yep. I think the players need to be aware of it. Retconning isn't something that I like to do very often. It is something that I like to have in my back pocket for when I need it, and I want players to know that they have that ability as well. Part of that is the grace period that I put into character sheets. In your first few sessions, you're allowed to change whatever the fuck you want, because you don't know. And I think that retconning can also make a difference if everyone agrees that it's just going to make for a better story. The point is, if a retcon doesn't make the story better for everyone, you got to really think about why you're putting it in there. Discuss. Player versus player action is acceptable during social interactions, during combat, or never. Absolutely a thing that you should be discussing if you are not aware of how your group works. This is a good point. I have seen games get ruined or wrecked because there was player versus player action when somebody did not expect it. I also would point out that player versus player action, it's a little more complicated than can we be socially against each other? Can we actually fight against each other? It's also, why are we potentially doing player versus player? If it's, hey, everything's justified by what my characters have done and we disagree, that's a lot different than sometimes my character wants to spar with another character. And that is separate from, I just want to be able to have the option that if my character decides that they want to, they can just go and fuck someone up. So these are that. What about GM versus player action? Well, that's if we had done clinic hours after dark, which will probably be next week at this point, because we're already an hour in and we still have another whole page and a bit to go. But after dark next week, confirmed. We'll get the sexy playlist on and everything. Discuss any RPG pet peeves that have not yet been addressed, and if the subject matter becomes serious, go immediately to the next point. So RPG pet peeves, other than the fact that I'm not a huge fan of the term pet peeve, I don't know why. I think it's just peeve as a word just rubs me the wrong way. Requiem, I don't know which point you're mentioning. Is it the point that I'm discussing now or the one that's coming up, the rating of your typical game? But any RPG pet peeves that have not yet been addressed and if the subject matter becomes serious. So I do think that this is an extremely weak sauce way of talking about lines and veils, maybe? Or if it's just things like, I don't like it when another player does this at the table, or I don't like it when the healer gets out in front. The healer should sit in the back. Like, if it's one of those things, then whatever. Yeah, discuss it. But I haven't seen any mention of safety tools yet, and we're going to see if that bears fruit next later on. But yeah, I guess it's fine to have a catch-all like, hey, if there's anything that pisses you off about role-playing, you should probably discuss it here. I will point out, though, that just because something pisses you off doesn't necessarily mean that you can go without it. As much as I want everybody to agree to things, and as much as people should be respecting each other's boundaries, there's also a certain amount of, you don't get to dictate what everyone else does. If you say, I don't like it when there's combat, but everyone else likes it when there's combat, then you don't get to dictate that for the entire table. So discussing, I believe, is the right thing as opposed to declaring. But they've used discuss throughout this, so that's fine. Discuss the rating of your typical game, such as G, PG, PG-13, R, or X. Note, do not underestimate the importance of this point for keeping a group together. Request that your players privately share anything they do not want to occur in the game, and determine another signal if they would not be comfortable saying, please stop during the game. So this is where they discuss safety tools. It's here. This isn't enough. I appreciate the fact that they put this in here, and I don't want to come down hard. I also have no idea when this was made. Maybe we can find out by seeing if there's a legal thing. Legal stuff. Nope, I don't see that there. This isn't enough to discuss safety. Safety needs to be its own critical element. It is not a, hey, privately share anything you don't want to have happen in the game. People should be publicly sharing what they don't want to have happen in the game. Lines and veils are for everyone to know. Recently enough for Stranger Things and Critical Role is true. But privately is no good. Now, I can see there being circumstances under which you might want to privately share information with somebody else at the table. This can absolutely be a thing. Like, hey, just so you know, here's an example that I can say. Just so you know, the last time that I was in a game with Alice, we disagreed on a lot of things. Now, we've since patched that up, but I just wanted to let you know that sometimes we can be a little combative. That might be a thing that you don't necessarily want to talk about openly, but you might want to let your storyteller know. I get that. But when it comes to safety, in general, it should be open, because your players could be just as likely to cross those boundaries as the storyteller is. And also, putting the onus on the storyteller to police the table sucks for everybody, because A, storyteller doesn't need that, and B, storyteller's probably not going to do as good a job as if everybody was on it. Saying also, determine another signal if they would not be comfortable saying please stop during the game, is essentially their way of suggesting things like an X card. Tools exist now. We can actually give people the tools. We're still working on coming up with like our codified list. We've been working at this for a long time. It takes a surprisingly long time to design something that's designed to be simple. And honestly, at this point, Disconcordia is now a gigantic test bed for it. But this is not enough. And it is, I don't want to come down on it because at least they put it there. Like I said before, there would be an entire section devoted to safety and consent and discussions about what the expectations are there. I also will say that as much as I appreciate the idea of rating a typical game using the same ratings that happen in the United States, that can be a good shorthand if people need it. I get it. But there are issues with that as well. The problem about a rating is that ratings vary depending on where you're from and what your morals are. In the United States, the Movie Picture Association of America is made up of essentially parents and religious leaders who decide whether something is acceptable for youth. And they are not an official government organization, but they wield a tremendous amount of power because some governments basically base their laws around what the MPAA does. But as Kate has mentioned, movies have different things. Like Kill Bill here was PG-13. It was R elsewhere. And in fact, we don't have the term PG-13 technically. We are 13 plus. Our ratings don't have the that necessarily, depending on also if you're going by Canadian ratings or Quebec ratings, which are different. So it's kind of a thing. If I utter the word fuck more than once, it's no longer PG-13, it's R. This is just kind of like my irritation with the way that the MPAA rates movies. You're allowed to say fuck once, but you're also only allowed to say fuck as an expletive and not as a verb. If you're doing that, then it counts differently or whatever. So technically, the guidelines are, and this is pretty solid. If you use the word fuck, you can only use it once. If you use it more than once, you are almost certainly bumped up to an R, which is funny. In the movie Get Shorty, which is about making a movie, they actually use the word fuck in describing how you can only say the word fuck once in a movie before hitting the R, which I thought was amazing. The difference between PG and PG-13, it's actually Steven Spielberg's fault, because some movies were designed to need just a little bit extra from PG-13. So that's a thing for us to keep in mind. So putting that down there because it's just more messages from work, which I shouldn't be doing. Ellie Spot mentions, I feel examples of risky play would help here to really make people understand what they're consenting to. How do you feel about sex, drugs, alcohol, violence, gore? These are all things that should be making up the safety discussion in a session 0, and that's what's missing here. What I might be okay with, I might be totally fine with sex in a game up to a certain point. And then once I hit that point, I'm like, I am no longer comfortable with this and wish to fade to black. I might feel very differently about the depiction of drugs. I might feel very differently about the depiction of violence. And violence, it might depend on who the violence is being applied to. Same thing with gore. I don't necessarily mind describing having somebody's arm ripped off, but I don't want to describe like each individual tendril. And I don't want to go too far into body horror is different than other kinds of horror. All of these things make a big difference. It's why this conversation has to be more complex and nuanced than that. And it's also why it's important to have those, because that's how you stretch. If I'm interested in, I mean, we'll get into this on Clinic Hours After Dark next week, but if I'm interested in seeing romance being played out, I might not want to stop at the same point as someone else would. But we should be in agreement on where that stop should take place, because we don't necessarily want to make one person feel uncomfortable. At the same time, if we've discussed it beforehand, then that means that we know to what point we can get to, and we also know how to signal to each other whether we're okay with what's happening or whether we're not. What I consider my cutoff point can vary from day to day. Maybe today I'm feeling like, okay, I'm feeling safe, I'm feeling secure, I'm feeling whatever. All of these things have to be discussed in another way. So it is a problem. R-rated films are allowed to have more than one fuck. It's PG-13 that typically isn't allowed to have more than one fuck. The other thing is that movie standards have started to shift and change, so it's possible you might be able to get away with more than one depending on the severity of the fuck. But I digress. The MPAA is awful. Anyway, so let's move on, because this is a big issue with me, and I would redo this and I would make it its whole section, and that section would be as long or longer than some of these other sections. This is not enough. I'm glad at least it made itself here, but we need to do way better than this. And I think that just to harp on a point that I've made several times, the point is not to say, here are the things that we can't do. The point is to give ourselves the freedom to know what we can do. The only reason that I'm able to stretch out and play elements of violence, sex, drugs, alcohol, whatever, in these games to the extent that I am, is that now I feel safe doing so. If I didn't feel safe, if I was like, I don't know if everyone's on the same page as me, then I wouldn't want to do it. So, discuss the consequences for breaking these rules. Note, consequences are required to keep players from abusing your group's agreements and spoiling the game for your more dedicated players. A simple disapproving look will work for some players, but others will need to be spoken with privately, and they may just not be a good fit for your game group. I don't like this. I don't like a punishment forward discussion here, because I think in making these agreements, the point is we're making this agreement, we expect it to be fulfilled. If you start saying, here are the various punishments that will mete out, here's the consequences for breaking these rules, then you're basically giving people, here's what you have to put up with if you don't feel like doing what we've got set out here. I think what's better is to just kind of discuss with players at the end, like, so we've got an agreement going, and if this agreement doesn't work for us, we'll have to renegotiate or the game's over. It's not a contract. Exactly. Things like, I also don't want to find out that if I say, hey, I got to miss this session, someone's like, well, according to our session 0, I have to give you a disapproving look, or you have to buy snacks for the next game for everyone, or whatever. I don't like bringing forward punishment like this. It doesn't feel good to me. Because the other thing is, if somebody makes a mistake, I don't want them to start then worrying about how they're going to get punished. And even worse than that is there are points where someone didn't make a mistake, falls afoul of one of these rules anyway, through no fault of their own, and then it starts becoming, okay, well, do we apply the punishment? It's not worth it. It's one of the things that we've been encouraging with our use of safety cards. If somebody pulls a yellow or a red, it doesn't mean necessarily that someone has done something wrong. If I push a little too hard on the violence or sex in a scene and somebody's like, I'm not feeling comfortable with this, that's not me being a bad person. That's somebody feeling like they have the right to stand up for themselves and say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this at this point. And that's fine for both players. What's wrong is if somebody then continues to push once they've been given that clear signal. So, yeah, I don't need a checklist to tell me to give disapproving looks. You're goddamn right, Kaiser Omnic. You're goddamn right. So, yeah, I would remove that. I think that in general, I would also hope that people, even though I know that this is designed for new players, I'd hope that in general people would kind of know there's only so much that we can put up with before things have to change. But let's not plan for failure. Campaign framework. Decide on the campaign setting. Blank. Okay, this is where I know that this is designed for D&D. Decide on the campaign setting. In a lot of games, the setting is nebulous. Some of them it's very specific. Decide the accessibility of magic. Decide the levels of technology. Decide the primary environments, forest, grassland, desert. So, okay, accessibility of magic and technology, that's establishing what your setting is, describing the world. And that is something that can be done in a session 0. Discuss the primary environments in terms of forest or grassland or desert or whatever. I don't see why that's there. I think I'd rather just be like, you're in this kind of area and it's sort of like this. Like, that's it, right? Like, the other thing is, yeah, depending on the game, this may not matter. You might be in a forest at the start of the game, and then in 3 sessions, you're in a desert. So, yeah, it's weirdly detailed compared to the safety section. Exactly. I want to be a pirate. Lol, there's no water here. So, discussing the primary environments, this is more like, we should discuss what the setting is going to be. Where are we going to start? And this is a conversation. Because it also matters, like Kate mentioned, if you're like, I want to be a pirate and I want to sail the 7 seas, and you're like, great, you're in Wyoming, it kind of makes it a little harder to be a pirate. It does feel very tactical, especially because describing things like forest, grassland, desert, Arctic, ocean makes me feel like, Are we discussing civilization map tiles, or are we playing a role-playing game? So, but then we move on to something a little bit better. Discuss the main themes: adventure, post-apocalyptic, political intrigue, mystery, horror, other. Yeah, I think this is a good thing to ask. I reserve the right to have themes shift if it seems to be that's where the story's going and that's where players are taking it. But I think that's a good thing to ask. If everybody wants an adventure game and you're like, but it's actually political intrigue, you got a problem, so you can work it out. Discuss the major threats: elemental forces, undeath, devils and demons, elder gods, nature, social upheaval, fairies, aliens, other. I guess. This kind of falls in with themes. I don't necessarily want to discuss what the threats are right away. I want that to be discussed in game. But I also want to make sure that my players are okay with it. And the reason why I know that they're okay with it is because I had a fucking safety discussion. I don't necessarily think that I'd want to discuss major threats unless players wanted to discuss that that's what they were looking for. Some games like to have that sort of thing planned out. Hey, guess what? This is going to be a game about taking down an evil lich. Here's the evil lich. Here's everything you need to know about the evil lich. You'll get there in about 12 levels. Let's go. That, fine. If that's the kind of game you're running, that's great. But other games don't necessarily want to start figuring out exactly where things are going to go. That's another reason why I think this is very specific to D&D. A political campaign in the Arctic against aliens? Yep, that's XCOM. Right fucking there. Decide the nature of the adventure, linear or non-linear. This kind of... Yeah, I could see that this being a decent thing to ask. Players may want to know, okay, this is a linear adventure. Are we playing a module? Are we playing a pre-written thing that somebody bought? Like an adventure that's sort of laid out for us? I think it's worth it for players to know, because then they might be a little less tempted to just go completely off the fucking rails because they know that it's not going to be there in the book. I think this is a good question to ask. I know that for me, I will almost never run linear adventures, and that's the way it is. So Requiem points out some insider info. As I recall, Bob the world builder was wanting this section to be more about the group building the world as a group and less about the storyteller just dropping them off someplace. Yep. But that depends on the kind of group that you're playing with. The rest of this list has done a pretty good job of saying, like, what kind of game do you want to play? What sort of spectrum do you want to have? But there isn't the expectation of how much do players want to work with the storyteller to figure out what this game is going to be in terms of the people around or what's happening. So I don't like the fact that this is here with that assumption, because maybe players don't want to know these things, or maybe players want to have, a little bit of input. I want the game to take place in a realm with high magic. I like magic. Okay, great. But then they don't necessarily want to be like, I definitely want to fight elder gods. So these are questions that I would say don't do a great job of representing all forms of play. I don't think they're necessarily bad things to discuss, but maybe not everybody is involved in the initial world building. Decide the typical mode of play, minis and tokens or theater of the mind. Yeah, I think that's kind of a given. Do people have minis? Then you're playing with minis. Do people not? You're not playing with minis. But yeah, I think that's worth kind of just figuring out. Especially if somebody's then going to have to go out and buy a whole bunch of minis. Decide at what level the characters will start the adventure. Now, I definitely know that this is D&D. Hey, thanks, DB3212, 3212. Dragon-blooded 3,212 out of 10,000. What level the characters will start the adventure? A lot of games don't have levels like this. This is a D&D, almost D&D Pathfinder, like specific games that have levels like this. So yeah, that's where this is coming from. Discuss how the characters will be connected to each other. NPCs Dragon Ball. Well, I actually knew part of that is also your avatar, which we've seen before on here, which is Goku. I'm just teasing because of ExalTwitch Academy and the fact that they're dragon-blooded, which is DB as well. Discuss how the characters will be connected to each other, NPCs, and the setting. Yeah, good thing to establish character backstories and get those links up. That's fine. That works for me. Oh, you found it? It's from 2020. Avatar of Cain has noticed on the note of age with John looking for it earlier, I found it at the very bottom that it's from 2020 sometime. Then there is no excuse. Sorry, Bob the World Builder. You've done an interesting job here. And again, I don't want to like blast you for this, but there's no excuse that a list like this in 2020 didn't have a better discussion of safety in role-playing games. It is my crusade at this point to get people on board on that safety and buy into it hard. So it's okay. Let me be a little more diplomatic. It's not there's no excuse. I would be like, honestly, when this was written, you had better access to better safety tools, and they should be in here. So there you go. Insider info. Ooh, let's keep going with insider info from Requiem Lost. He likes his players to be connected to at least one NPC and one PC. Yeah, decent. I don't necessarily have that kind of requirement. It kind of depends on what's going on. But it's nice to have connections. Having somebody with no connections to anything implies the lone wolf, edgelord player character type, and those are often very difficult to handle, as we have discussed many times on here. And if people really want to, I can go into it again. But let's keep going. House rules. Character statistics. Point by, standard array, rolling, other. Yeah, this was designed for D&D. Note, be sure to explain the actual method you prefer when rolling, etc. House rules are kind of by default. They need to be mentioned in a session 0 especially if it involves character creation. If it's a major house rule, not all house rules I think can make it into a session 0. You might not think of them, or they may not come up. But a good idea to bring them up if you can. Leveling up, experience points, milestones, gold, other, D&D. Increasing hit points as written, take maximum, other, D&D. Alignment, D&D. Determines actions determined by actions not used, other. Racial bonuses as written, not used, other. Race or class restrictions, backgrounds, encumbrance, critical success, failures, inspiration, number of skill check attempts, initiative, starting gold, resting, death, homebrew. So most of these are D&D specific. Death and resurrection is something that I'm going to very specifically highlight. Let me scroll down so that you can actually see it. Death is something that I don't think is due for a redesign. Death. Let's redesign death. In role-playing games that are heavy on the stats and the rolling and the mechanics, and heavy focus on combat, especially if the combat is well balanced, like you'll find in D&D, I think the death can be a significant threat and put it in there. I think in other games, death is a lot more nebulous. And I think that it's appropriate to discuss with your players what will actually bring about death or not. Because I don't want to kill players. Not unless the death actually makes good sense for the story. Because the story is what I'm kind of going for in the games that I run. And I really don't want, because somebody rolled poorly, to kill them. I also don't necessarily want somebody, just because they did a couple of dumbass things, to die. Now, what I'll typically tell players is, if you're doing something stupid, I'll warn you. If you continue to do something stupid, then you may die. Or I might say, this isn't necessarily stupid, but it's risky. Your character risks death. One thing that I've used in games in the past, which I've actually worked really well, is occasionally I'll start a session by saying, this session can be lethal. And the reason why I say that is because also players can immediately be like, I'm not in the mood to play a lethal game today. And that's a good thing to know. Or at least it prepares players to think like, this is a critical moment in the story. I may lose my character. maybe that's what I want. Because characters sometimes want to die, or players want their characters to die, I should say. And because it makes for a cool moment. Sometimes a death in your favorite television show or movie is an amazing time, or even video games these days. So we might want to see it. We might want to see it in a role-playing game. But if there's one thing that really, really, really frustrates me is resurrection. If somebody's dead and the point is that they're supposed to be dead, it really stinks when you can be like, except you're not. When circumstances allow, I can just resurrect you. Because in a world with resurrection, death just doesn't matter nearly as much. So you really have to talk about whether resurrection is possible or not. And I think maybe one of the reasons why it's mentioned here is because Matt Mercer specifically has alternate death rules that he uses for Critical Role. Which is why it's written resurrection as written or other, instead of saying resurrection as written, other, or not, because he has an alternate situation there. The key for me is you have to decide what role death is going to play in your game. You might say you're not going to die. Your player characters will not die, and that will be fine. There are ways to play that, and it'll be lots of fun for everybody, and you can still have thrilling moments and stakes and all that, and that's cool. But there's also circumstances where you want to say, like, death, it can happen to NPCs, but not PCs. Or death can happen to PCs under certain circumstances. Or death is something that we'll go and we'll discuss. And one of the, as a very minor spoiler warning I'll throw out there, in a recent episode of ExalTwitch Academy, I had a player say, well, I don't have any health anymore. I guess I'm dead. And I was like, no. Because in Exalted Essence, there are no specific PC death rules other than when you are out of health, you have to discuss with your storyteller what happens next. And the implication is not necessarily that you're dead. And I think that that's great, because I don't necessarily want somebody to die like that. But I also want the option that if you've run out of health and it's a great moment for your character to die, then you die. So there's that. Angel Wick, rewinding the last few moments of fate is not the same as resurrection. That's preventing the death from happening in the first place. I throw one of my broken plastic knife bits. So in general, though, house rules, definitely things that can be discussed. All things that can be gone over and are interesting for people to figure out. But they should be discussed if they're going to deviate the game significantly or if they're going to cause a lot of change or problems. What's next? You can play a short quest at the end of your session 0 or maintain that excitement for the first full session of your campaign. Sorry, but that language kind of makes me think like it's sort of sexual. Like, okay, so I can give you release now, or I can just, tease you until the next time. If you can maintain your excitement. So Kate mentions, also, if you tell the storyteller you're okay to die heroically, maybe also tell your fellow players who are able to do things like reverse time or death. I would say if you want to die, tell your fellow players. If you're okay with dying, you don't necessarily have to. Surprise can sometimes be nice in a game. It really depends on your players. Maybe you should talk about this in your session 0 about like, what do you think about this? But yeah, it would really suck if you're like, I want to die here, and then another player pulls out all the stops and prevents your death. You might not be great. Instead of, you saved my life, it's you ruined my death, to quote The Incredibles. What's next? So you can play a short quest at the end of your session 0 or maintain that excitement for the first full session of your campaign. And remember, these decisions are not set in stone. A good thing to be put in there. You should check in with your players on a regular basis to ask for honest feedback about what they like and do not like about the campaign. This intentional improvement should keep your group together for the long haul. First of all, not every group needs to be there for the long haul. A relationship does not have to be permanent for it to be successful. Short-term relationships can be amazing and then can be really gratifying, and they don't necessarily become a failure even if they didn't end necessarily well. Slap a DNR bracelet on. Yeah, almost, right, Kate? The idea that long haul, I mean, like, this I'm being super nitpicky for, but like, yeah, just don't, like, a game that only lasts 5 sessions, maybe that's all the game you want. Maybe you don't need any more than that. Maybe you only want 1 session. Maybe you want 162. I don't know. Figure yourself out. 136 or whatever. Now, yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of not comfortable discussing Buffy right now. I feel kind of weird about Buffy at the moment. So yes, it is true that you want groups to sort of check in with each other privately, publicly. We do that. You don't necessarily see every time we do. More insider info. He suggested a newer group not have a short quest at the end of session 0, as it could kill that excitement. Well then. Oh, I'm getting messages from JT. So streaming at the moment. He says the internet's about to burn, and I have a feeling like it's because of the Nintendo Direct, which is happening as I'm streaming right now, and I'll get all that news later on. So yeah, I don't know why that's said. Is it the idea that he suggested a new group not have that short quest at the end of session 0, as it could kill the excitement because they might be like ultimately disappointed and they're like, oh, that sucked. I don't know. He includes a suggestion which he discourages. Yeah. Plot twist: this is not just for new groups. Yeah, I'm not sure why he's saying that new groups may not want to have the short session 0. Because I think it also depends. How long did your session 0 take? And how long were you planning on hanging out together? And when's the next time you can hang out? It would really suck if you did your session 0 and you're like, well, the next time we can get together is in 6 months. That's kind of a long time to maintain that tingle, as it were. So there's a thought. Dragon Ball asks a quickish question. Let's have a look at this quickish question. Quickish question. Tonight's session, I don't know if I want the guys to fight one really strong guy to scare my players for things to come, or if I want to have them fight one guy who is around their level but fully powered up / Super Saiyan who is friends, and maybe one of them will jump in and essentially try to make sure the guy doesn't die and allow the baddies to get away to fight later. Regardless, today is a setup session to build tension for future things. Some of that's going to depend on your system. Some systems, solo threats are just never going to be that scary because of the way that players can just use like pack tactics or ganging up or just the sheer numbers that they have in order to take them down. And some systems make this not a problem at all. As my players have recently discovered with ExalTwitch Academy, some of them, sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes another, and honestly, I'm thrilled that both of them exist. But you're asking specifically for this. Is this like a rival, or is this the big bad? A big bad that's just as strong as everybody else might be a little strange when later on when they finally manage to confront this person, and then it's like, oh, my system's a custom system that you've been building and working for over 23 years. Well, then some of that question is going to be determined by you. If we're looking at do you want to have a moment? Okay, let me ask this. Fast forward to the final confrontation with this person. Do you want to have one of your PCs face off against this PC alone, one-on-one? If that's the eventual idea, then you want to make sure that this person is stronger than the PCs, but not really strong. If the intention is that finally the fight is going to be that this one really strong person is going to face off against all of them alone, start them as way too strong. Or if the concept is that this person is going to face off against the group alongside other people who are equally strong, figure out what you want to eventually have happen. What's the goal? What's the future? And once you have that, you can kind of play it back and figure out what you're going to need now. But I will also point out that players will sometimes sense what you're trying to do. So if you have players who like to enable what you're trying to do, then if you present them with like, this is the big bad, don't bother attacking the big bad, he's way too strong and powerful for you, they'll play into it. But you might have some who don't read into it, and they'll just be like, no, I'm going to attack. And then when they can't win, be like, this is unfair. You gave us something unfair. You suck. It really depends on your players at that point. You kind of have to know what they want. There can be a real frustration issue, even with players who you think you know. If you present them with something and they come away and being like, there's no way for us to win. Without kind of being like, well, you're not supposed to win now. You're supposed to win in like 20 episodes after you've powered up and shit. And they might be like, nope, no way to win. We're just going to have to face it. We're not good enough. So I apologize. I apologize. I've never actually, I don't know much about Dragon Ball. I've never watched it or read it. It feels like a D&D mentality, the idea that every encounter should be winnable, or at the very least that players will be like, what? That's a dragon turtle. We're level 1. There's no way we can beat a dragon turtle. Run. That they kind of know that something is unbeatable. You don't want to make your players feel despair. So I would say that of the situations that you suggested, having somebody who's fully powered up and they're not, and be that much stronger, provides a little less despair, because you can kind of point out, this guy was ready for the fight. You weren't. One day you will be ready for the fight, and then you'll have a fighting chance. As opposed to, this guy basically can flick you with his little finger and you'll die. Why bother going against him? So, want to see a Dragon Ball Z where the power-up fails to go off like a failed sneeze. Wow. That's harsh stuff. That's harsh stuff. Kind of like a boo. Yeah. So that's kind of the situation that we're at. Yeah, we're gonna see what's gonna happen with that. And nothing wrong with the big bad evil guy being like, come back and fight me when you are stronger, just don't overdo it. Yeah. So in general, just make sure that you don't instill despair would be my best piece of advice for you. But you might also want to make it critically clear that you do not intend for this encounter to be the decisive one. Heck, put them at two sides of a river so that they can taunt each other, but they can't reach each other. Or, it depends on what the player's abilities are. But it can also feel really bad if you're like, yeah, here's the person who you absolutely are going to have to kick his ass. And they're like, well, I want to kick his ass now. And you're like, well, you can't. Why? Because I said so. Like it doesn't work as well for players, because then it feels like railroading. I'm dangling something in front of you, but I'm also telling you can't do it. If you engineer the circumstances around it to make sure that it's clear that this is not the time they were meant to fight, you can get away with it. If your players have the expectation that sometimes they'll go up against somebody, fail utterly, they go through a training montage, now they can beat it, that's also useful. So all of these things, handy to know. It's really hard to GM like a normal RPG. Yeah. Well, when you get super powered like that, the problem is that if you're writing Dragon Ball, you can decide what works and what doesn't. It's what's known as a hard magic versus a soft magic. The idea that, does your magic system have absolute rules that need to be followed, or is the magic system just kind of nebulous in there? Kind of like bending in Avatar: The Last Airbender or Legend of Korra. There isn't kind of like a specific rule set. There are some things like there's certain techniques that certain benders have unlocked. Not everybody can bend. There are certain rules, but like also, what can a waterbender do? Depends on the waterbender, and it depends on what's around, and it depends on what the needs of the episode are that day. So Dragon Ball definitely is not what I would call a hard magic system. So hopefully that answers your question. Do we have any other questions thrown out there? We got 20 minutes to go. We got time. Although, of course, remember that if it's a specific question about relationships or sex and role-playing, we may bump it by a week. What can a waterbender do? Whatever the story dictates that episode? Yeah, basically. But the thing is, because that show is well written and it is a blast and the world is fun, we don't care that there's differing levels of disparity. The idea that somebody who can command elements going up against somebody who has a sword, and the person with the sword can, like 99% of the time, if you're not a bender, you can't face a bender, but apparently sometimes you can, and when is questionable. But it doesn't matter because we watch the show and we have fun with it, right? So, bloodbending broken as hell. Bloodbending can only be used on the night of a full moon. Spoilers. But yes, bloodbending is broken as hell. But there's also determination of like, what can you do and what can't you do? Can an airbender pull all the air out of your body? I don't know. Can an airbender just blast you so high up into the sky and then just let you fall to your death? Probably. So like a lot of it is also, we don't do things because we just don't want it to be ridiculous, which is why the Avatar role-playing game that's coming out from Magpie Games, very specifically, as far as I can tell, I only have access to the quick start like pretty much everyone else. You don't, like, your bending, it doesn't really matter. Like, you're not going to get like, well, here are the different moves you can do as a waterbender. It's more abstract than that. And the reason why it's more abstract is because it shouldn't fucking matter. What matters more is the game and the story going on. All right, here's a Session Zero question I was curious about that perhaps ExalTwitch Academy can give an example of. But how would you go about floating a system change for an ongoing game if things aren't working or could be that little bit better? So we did do a session change. We very deliberately did a session change for ExalTwitch Academy. We started with Exalted 3rd Edition and then swapped over to the manuscript edition of Exalted Essence, which, again, manuscript has a lot not going for it right now. I still really like the system so far, but it definitely has a lot of things that are not fully baked. So I don't necessarily recommend that people start playing it just yet. So how do you go about floating a system change? You talk to your players. I know it sounds like a really like inane thing, but you say, hey, I think maybe this could work. This is an idea that I would like to throw out there. I think this would be a cool thing for us to look at. And if they're not down, well, that's too bad. Fuck. God damn it. God damn it. That's too bad. I just found out who's going to be voicing Mario in the because it popped up on another window on my screen. Who's going to be voicing Mario in the Illumination Super Mario Brothers movie, and it's Chris Pratt. God damn it. Fuck. Whatever. The rest of the cast looks pretty cool. Anyway, so what I would do is I'd talk to them. I would lay a case for it. And it's going to depend on that. But there isn't really much you can do. You can't kind of sneak a system change on them. You're just going to have to discuss it. Yeah, I don't know if there's much more that I can say beyond that. Like, we discussed it because we recognized that there was a system that was coming out that we thought might work better for streams, and we thought maybe we'd give it a shot. We also had another part where we were like, well, we might be like the first people to do this, so it might be neat for other people to see this system in action over the course of a longer game, as opposed to like one-shots that Onyx Path were putting out. But that's not necessarily, like that was a minor consideration for us at best. But our main thing was maybe this will be better. And we looked at the manuscript and thought, yep, this will probably be better for us. And we're giving it a shot now. If there's any tips or tricks beyond using word hold that I'd found over time. All right. So this is, instead of how do you go about floating a system, I would say what you should consider before floating a system. What should you consider? Are your players system averse? I have had players who role play and they love role playing, but they never want to pick up a rule book. They hate learning new things. And they're like, well, why can't I just play the thing that I want to play? This is part of the reason why D&D is so popular. People play D&D and they're like, oh, well, now I bothered to learn this and I don't want to bother learning anything else. I've put in the time. If your players are averse to learning new things, it may not be worth bringing up. Or you have to find a way to suggest it to them in a way that you can provide to them the benefits of swapping that counterbalance the negative aspect, which is you have to learn something new. So the idea of, well, I know that we've been playing a lot of D&D, but I'd rather play Pathfinder instead. You have to be able to make a case as to why Pathfinder is going to be better. And that case has to be better than, and it's going to cause a lot of disruption to our game. Everyone's going to have to make new characters, or we're going to have to find a way to translate our characters from one to the other. We're going to have to learn all new rules for all these things. We're going to have to buy new books. We're going to have to potentially get new dice. You have to be able to overcome those. If you can't, don't bother. You're out of luck. The next thing, as DJ Zesty said, system changes are well to be tested in a one-shot with little to no canon repercussions. That's another option that you can do. Be like, hey, we can try this out. Again, some people are going to be like, but I don't want to stop our game. I like our game and I don't want to. Understandable, right? So you kind of also have to know not only how does your group react to new rules, but how does your group react to change and difference? Are they unseelie? Is change good? Or are they seelie? Okay, that was dorky even for me. But that's a thing to look at, right? Now, when it comes right down to it, what matters most about a game isn't the system, isn't the setting, isn't the players, isn't the storyteller. It's everything. It's all interconnected. It is one of the things, one of the core aspects of my professional life is convincing people that I can't take a story in one game and put it into a different kind of game without changing that story. You can't even change a rule in your game without it affecting the story that I'm trying to tell. So that is a thing that we just have to keep in mind. That's the life. So it is important to remember that there are going to be changes. Are you ready to put up with those changes? Are your players or storytellers willing to put up with that? That's the question. So if you can, great. If you can't, bleh. It's funny, the captions don't help. The captions don't accurately get bleh It just doesn't put anything down there, which I suppose is to be expected. Oh well. At any rate, yeah. So I guess that's kind of what I'd put out there. You might enjoy reading new books and learning new systems. Your players may not. Maybe your players also have complaints about your current system, and you're like, this is how we can solve them. Hey, it's really complicated for me to figure out what I got to do next. Okay, well, why don't we play this game where the combat is a lot less complicated? Hey, I really don't like the fact that I don't have the ability to really fine-tune how my character works. Okay, well, we'll play this system where it does. Recognize where the needs are in your game, what the holes are, and how you can fill those holes. Also recognize what the pain points will be in the new system and make sure that people are aware of those as well. You do not want to swap games and then have somebody say, what do you mean I can't do this? And then they get mad, they flip the table, they walk out, they punch your door on the way out. It gets a little bit of a dent. You find that you can't close the door as smoothly as you once did. So now you kind of have to lean into it. Now that you're leaning into it, it makes a loud sound when the door closes. Because it makes a loud sound, you wake up your partner every time you come home late. Now your partner realizes that this is happening more and more often. They thought they were just going to bed early. Turns out you've been sneaking out all this time. Now your partner knows that you've been sneaking out. But of course, what have you been doing with all that time sneaking out? Turns out you've been going to a library and reading rules for a game that your partner doesn't even want to play. So be careful about that. Anyway, thanks, Kaiser Omnic, for tuning in. It was good to see you. Always good to see you. It's always good to see the rest of you. We're kind of closing in on the end of another clinic hours here. So I can actually just... There. There we are. Has this happened to you? No, actually, it has not. Which I am grateful for. Because I also use my word hole when it comes to my partner, and I don't go to a library to read game rules. I can do that from the comfort of my own office. RPG infidelity can be a joke, though. A couple of random thoughts. Hey, thanks. Look, it's JT Silver, everyone. JT being the person who has... let me know about the disappointment that is the casting of Mario in the new movie. But that's okay. JT, who is somebody who I desperately want to roleplay with, and yet it is difficult for time, distance, and lack of scheduling takes me away from him. And it pains me to my core. Because he's a super cool guy, and I would love to roleplay with him. At any rate, a couple of things that I'll just remind people on our way out while we're waiting for extra questions that potentially can come in. The first is that tomorrow I believe there is a Punchy. That's over on twitch.tv/Elizabeth A. Neal at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, -4 GMT. It's or plus no -4. Yeah, -4. They're playing Ass Effect 2. Is the bot not operating at this point? God damn it. I don't know, the computer's on. I don't know what's going on. At any rate, that's tomorrow. On Saturday, Drew Crew, I think, is happening, and I believe Scott may be taking a break from Doomed because he's just finished his campaign. And then on Sunday we have ExalTwitch Academy, episode 11 of season 2. It was a good episode. Last episode was a lot of fun. Looking forward to seeing what's happening more on that. Knowing that our seasons are about 20 episodes long, it's an interesting to look at. And we'll have to decide whether we're going to renew for another season or not. And of course, some of that is up to your comments. So that's a thing to keep in mind. Beyond that, folks, it looks like we don't actually have any specific questions to throw out there at the very end. So I will leave you with a thought. And that is the next time that you're sitting down at your table, the next time that you are playing at a game, whether it's online, whether it's in person, or whatever, try to think of a way that you can specifically, like this is specific practice here, this isn't just a general notion, find a specific thing that you can do that you know will make someone else's day, and do it. Find out just how amazing role-playing can be when you're trying to make everyone have fun and not just yourself. How's my day been? My day's been good. I've been really enjoying seeing the play on Disconcordia happening. Lots of people doing it, people who are new to Changeling, people who are veterans at Changeling, all coming together to have fun. It's great, and it is something that I'm looking forward to exploring more. Next week, Clinic Hours, though. Clinic Hours After Dark, talking about relationships and sex in role-playing. Once again, we revisit this topic from time to time because there's always new stuff to talk about, and it will be interesting to see how people feel, especially after over a month of participating in a mass game, which is turning out a little hornier than... okay, I lie. I always expected it to turn horny, but faster than I anticipated as opposed to not. So there is that as well. We had hot takes. Any chance for spicy takes? I don't know, man. Like, spicy takes? They were already kind of, like, spicy. We'll see. Part of it is also, it'll kind of depend on whether we end up retooling this time slot. But we'll see. I mean, look, here... Okay, shall I say one thing then about Disconcordia before we go? We're going to have to do some serious long and hard thinking, because one of the things that I definitely do not want to have happen is for people to feel like they have to pair off in that game, that they must be in a romantic relationship, or that these romantic relationships have to follow a certain code. You must be monogamous, otherwise you're a bad person. It's Changeling, so you must be polyamorous, otherwise you're a bad person. You must, once you're in a relationship, that relationship has to last for until death do you part. Changelings are very fond of the whole, like, I will swear love to you for a month, or a year and a day, or whatever. These are all things that I want to make sure of, because as much as I love the idea of love and sex being part of that game, I do not love the idea of making it feel like it is a requirement, or that people have to have it in order to have fun, or that it will block you from playing with other people. We will definitely be talking about that next week. So if you aren't playing in Disconcordia, have a look. And if you are worried about playing in Disconcordia because you're not aware of the system, or you're not aware of the setting, yep, it's going to involve a little bit of work on your part. It will. I freely admit that, because we can't necessarily sit down and tutor you all the time. But I can tell you that it'll be worth it, and it is a lot of fun for that. I don't necessarily believe in adventure over romance. I believe in making sure that there's a healthy option for all. Which means now you know part of the reason why I don't like having two PCs in a game enter into a game in a relationship, because it makes everyone feel like a third wheel. And you definitely don't want that in a mass game either. So we'll talk about all that. But in the meantime, go play, go have fun, go enjoy your role-playing games. And if you can, I know it might be difficult, but use that word hole. See you next time.